Ding! What does the world's wildest boy, a cigarette box, and an old town hall song have in common? Well, I'm guessing you read the title of this video film, so no doubt you figured it out already. Hi everybody, it's me, your old pal Ashley here to tell you the real facts about everyone's favorite Dennis the Menace. No, not that one. So sorry. Dennis the Menace has a long and, dare I say, successful career, outlasting his fancy pants American cousin. Starring in multiple TV shows and specials, he has also had many annuals, summer specials, and even the Beano Superstar collection became 90% about him. So iconic was Dennis the Menace, even his iconic red and black striped jumper was ripped off by Kurt Cobain. Dennis the Menace is a UK icon, whether you like him or don't like him, he is undeniably undeniable, and despite all those fancy things I have just spewed out of my mouth, I feel like he doesn't get the respect he honestly deserves. Well, today that changes. Okay, it doesn't change, but I'm going to make a real effort to get across his relevance and impact as I break down a digestible amount of his history. So put your club badges on and take a seat, softies. This is going to be punk as
As Dennis the Menace from Venice, his friends laugh, ha-ha, 'cause he can't drive a car. But this guy's not so dumb, 'cause they can't walk back from his gondola. Dennis the Menace from Venice, in his blue velvet suit, he looks perky and cute, and he wears a red sash just to match his mustache. He's a dandy.
Dennis the Menace from Venice, a 1935 British Hole song by Eddie Polo. Imagine you're an Englishman person in the late 1930s. There really isn't much going on. You haven't had World War II yet, and brutalizing the Irish has gone unfortunately a little bit out of fashion, so your only options were town halls. It seems inevitable that eventually you would hear this catchy little ditty that would just earworm itself right into your brain. Dennis the Menace from Venice. It's fun to say, it's memorable, and so memorable in fact that 16 years later in 1951, the Beano editor George Mooneyboy Mooney assigned it to the chief sub-editor Ian Chisholm and illustrator David Law. The brief was to create a character that fits the name. Let's hope there isn't some other comic artist at this time somewhere in the world with a misbehaving child called Dennis, or we may have an embarrassingly inexplicable coincidence. David Lowe was known at the time for a comic strip about a cheeky little chap in the People's Journal. Years before Cuddles and Dimples, Lowe was drawing the wee fella, a cheeky little brat who would menace his parents and others. Lowe and Ches got right to work and headed straight to the pub, St. Michael's Inn to be exact. So, the lads, they're in the pub right, bantering away, and Ches is trying to get across how he wants the character to be conveyed, but he isn't very happy with what Lowe is giving him. Ches, fancying himself as a bit of an artist too, decides to draw the character himself on a cigarette packet, and boom! Comic history! Instead of some boring blonde 6-year-old, Ches scribbled a wobbly-kneed, black spiky-haired, shorts-wearing, big-socked, scowling, asbo-walking 10-year-old thug. Now that's a menace. Lowe took it from there, and a few more drawings and drinks later, not only had they invented the concept of drink and draw events, but also the biggest Beano star of all time, Dennis the Menace. Here we can see the original artwork of the first Dennis the Menace comic. The artwork would be drawn at double the size it appeared in the comic, allowing for more detail. Lowe was a perfectionist and would often deliver his work with patches where he had redrawn characters or other parts of the comic. You can see a few here where he redid the speech bubbles. The comic itself is a very simple story of Dennis acting the maggot at a park. Dennis, the hardy boy he is, walks on the grass ignoring the sign. His dad tells him to keep off it, so obviously he does some handstands on and swings off a tree. Dad, having had enough, puts the dog collar on Dennis and walks him through the park to keep him under control. Hilarious. You know, sidebar, I once myself as a young lad walked on some grass I shouldn't have, and a nun ran up to me and took my photo to report me to my school, and that was in 2004. Imagine the seriousness of walking on the grass in 1951. A nun at the time would do a lot worse to you than take your photo. This Dennis right out the gate was punk as, well, you know the swear word I want to say. Some notes on this first comic. Dennis doesn't have his trademark jumper, just a shirt and black striped tie. Also, you would be forgiven for thinking this is Gnasher, but it is in fact just a nondescript dog. Cute though. Despite not being what we want, I still like this Dennis design a lot. He's so stocky and bold looking. A lot of early low comics would also have Dennis doing poses with his arms behind his back, which I really like the look of. It was possibly done just so he wouldn't have to draw hands, but it looks cool regardless. One panel that is iconic in this first outing is of him smiling and thinking to himself, "Keep off the grass, huh?" Looking at it this time, I can't help but notice this dash line. Usually in old comics and cartoons, this would be used to show where they are looking, but he's looking at nothing, so it's a little strange. All in all though, a fine debut for the Menace. Before we move on, I thought it might be fun to talk quickly about the other Dennis comic. The strip made its debut on March 12, 1951. The UK Dennis first appeared on a comic dated, keyword here being dated, the 17th. The lore is that they came out on the same day, and to be honest, I haven't seen any concrete proof of that, and if anything, it seems more likely that actually the UK Dennis came out first. Some reports I have seen claim that the UK Dennis did actually appear on store shelves on the 12th, so let's just take that as gospel. They came out the same day with the same name, and that's just neat. Other than the name, however, the two characters have literally nothing in common. The UK Dennis was a menace in the sense that he was a bully and a hooligan. The US Dennis, in contrast, was just an annoying child. In all seriousness though, the US Dennis strips, particularly its earlier runs, were great. I love the art style of this comic and it's quite clever and fun. The look though seemed to change at some stage to this other style, which is not my particular cup of tea, but that's enough about the US Dennis. He's a softy and this video isn't about him, so let's go back to the real Menace. Here comes the red and black. You were all expecting some super interesting story about how he got his stripes, right? Well, there isn't one. Or maybe there actually is. Ooh, matron. Initially, he just seems to wear the stripes one day. I'm sorry, I'm disappointed too. We can still look at the first appearance though. Huh? How does that sound? Yeah? That sounds good, right? Doesn't it? Maybe we will inexplicably stumble upon an interesting story that I alluded to earlier. So what do we have to lose? So here we go. Right away, you know the stripes are here to stay. In the comic title, you can see the same image that has been used since the beginning, but now Dennis is drawn with his new jumper. So they're official. It's the same title all the other Dennis strips had used to this point, but they amended it to add the new jumper. In this first striped jumper comic, Dennis keeps shooting the cat up the arse with his pea shooter. He is caught and has his weapons locked up, but luckily he has a lockpicking made easy book ready to go. That's something I liked in old comics and cartoons. Whenever they needed something, they would always have a very specific book ready to go. So he starts to unlock the door and voila! I think? I don't know. The comic isn't very good in terms of clarity. When we see him later, he seems to buy a half-pound worth of peas off some boy who may or may not be relevant later. And he picks up some sort of big pipe instead of the pea shooter he was using earlier. After a second read, I think I know what happened. So it seems that Dennis had gotten the peas that were locked away but not the pea shooter. And this seemingly unimportant boy was just used to help him put all the peas into his mouth. For some reason. Well, he goes looking for the cat but slips and falls on his arse and swallows all of the peas, putting him off his dinner. It seems this Dennis is just full of peas, just full of penis. So what does that mean?
I will eat your penis!
Shut up, Dennis. Not the best comic or debut for his new jumper. Certainly needed some refining in my opinion. The comic does get across his needless viciousness though, as he actively goes out of his way to torture a cat, so that's nice. Speaking of nice, some nice details include seeing that cat in the background of some shots watching Dennis. Well, that was certainly a letdown, but not to worry. In 2001, something wonderful happened. a retcon. But not just any retcon, a very well thought out retcon. Before we get to it though, first let's look at this earlier David Lowe comic from the 14th of March. That boy we saw pour peas down Dennis's throat in the later comic is here, and if you notice he has the classic Dennis the Menace jumper. So what seems to have happened is that someone in the office or David Lowe himself liked this jumper and decided to give it to the Menace. Jumping forward again to 2001, we get this unreleased comic, at least not in the Beano or any Beano annual. Here we see the secret origin of Dennis the Menace's jumper, beautifully drawn by David Parkins, who manages to faithfully recreate David Lowe's art style. In the comic we see a man complain to a sergeant about some scamp in a dull shirt smashing his car window. He points to Dennis saying it could be him beside the lad in the very striking hoop jersey. Dennis agrees that the shirt is dull and plans a menacing scheme. Cut to later, Dennis and Softy, the boy he used to pal around with in those other comics, wonder will anyone ever set foot on the moon. Dennis accurately predicts when and reckons he can beat it to the punch. He gets his granny's powerful pop, wraps them around Softy's legs, a good shake or two, and Softy takes off, leaving behind his black and red jersey, as well as the inspiration for the movie Thunderpants. Probably. Dennis then rightfully claims the jumper for himself. Hooray! Now that's a retcon. It fits perfectly in with the early comics and doesn't break or ruin anything, and in fact actually helps. This might even be the best Dennis comic strip ever. It really captures his spirit perfectly. There have been many Dennis artists over the years, and thankfully they haven't all been called David. Only most of them have. I thought it would be fun to have a look at some of the most prominent ones. Obviously there have been other artists who have worked on the character in spin-offs such as the Fun Size Beano, the Beano Library, and the Beano Superstar series, but I want to give most of the attention to the big dogs. We have already mentioned David Lowe. This David would draw the character for almost 20 years before passing the baton to another David after he became ill. Who is this other David? Well, it's none other than the big fella, David Sutherland. It's hard to be a follow-up. People tend to always hold the first and original in higher regard. That is, unless you are David Sutherland. Not satisfied enough by becoming the artist that defined the Bash Street Kids, after Leo Baxendale, he decided to do the same thing again with Dennis the Menace. The workload David had must have been crazy. He was already drawing Biffo the Bear on the front cover after the death of Double DW. 3 huge important strips for the comic drawn by one man in 3 different styles. That is why David is the big fella. If there was ever a Beano artist Mount Everest, it would undoubtedly be him, Double DW, Leo Baxendale, and Jim Petrie, with a smelly sock on top somewhere for Tom Patterson. David Parkins was next, and he is maybe my favorite Dennis artist. He built off the big fella's late 90s design and perfected it. It's a shame his run didn't last longer, as it ended in 2003, so the shortest run so far, but the Dennis look would continue for a long time. Nigel Parkinson, Jimmy Hansen, and Tom Patterson would work on the strip going forward until the 2009 reboot. Out of these 3, I probably prefer Nigel Parkinson's work. He is really an underrated artist in the Beano pantheon. He would also do a lot of the strips during the reboot run where the character was made to look like an animated version. Thankfully, after the show ran its course, Barry Appleby returned the character to his natural state for a year. Finally, from 2012 on, the comic has been drawn by Nigel Parkinson and written by Nigel Ochterlony? Ochterlony. It seems the age of Davids has finally ended and the dawn of the Nigels has come, as they continue to work as the main artist and writer of the comic to this very day. There have been other artists here and occasionally there. One that stands out in particularity is Mike Pierce, who primarily drew special Bash Street Kid stories that would star other Beano characters like Dennis the Menace. Dennis, relatively speaking, hasn't had many artists considering his lengthy run, but has had many different looks. Here is my illustration of what I consider to be the main looks throughout the years. I feel people's favorites are often dependent on when you were a reader. My personal favorite, for example, has always been the late 90s and early 2000s Dennis, but drawing this picture I really found some appreciation for the early David Lowe Dennis and the bulky Thug Dennis from the 70s and 80s. I don't love the modern Dennis, if I'm being honest. He's a bit slim and seems a little more generic. Two things I consider essential for a cool Dennis look are joined eyes and a mouth connected to the nose that cuts through the eyes. Honestly, that staple though hasn't always been there like you might think, and it has mostly been just the angles and the small print of the comic art that made it look like it was there longer than it actually was. So it's actually hard to pinpoint the exact time it became a definitive thing. The modern Dennis for a while had neither joined eyes nor a tuggish smirk connected to his eyes. These separated eyes would eventually be put back together, but there were plenty of strips of them separated, but I'm glad he has the Sonic eyes back. Unfortunately, they haven't given us that tuggish grin back, but beggars can't be choosers. Still though, I feel the art is just a little bit too flat. Here is just a random panel and it's fine, but I think a little more detail and shading could really help the art out. I think that they have Nigel overworked because he's very talented, but the modern comics don't do much for me. Not bad by any means, but compared to earlier Dennis art, it's just not the same. And Nigel is more than capable because he's been drawing the Beano for so many years and has done so many different art styles, so I know he has it in him to be the best Dennis artist he can be. What I really blame for all these changes was the earlier 2009 design that started all of this trend. I mean, the art itself is nice enough, but it separated the eyes and changed the iconic smile. Again, it's not a terrible looking art style or anything, but it was part of a pattern. Other Bad Dennis designs include the very early lanky Dennis. This Dennis was around for a while. The character had only just been promoted to a full page in 1953, and then in 1954 he was suddenly really tall. It didn't make him any more threatening, just kind of awkward looking. He was also moved to the back page with colour and would remain this way for 4 years. He would get more or less back to normal, but by the time he was banished back to the inside of the Beano, but luckily he wouldn't remain there for long. By 1962 he was put back on the back page. This was a good spot. Today it's not as big a deal, but at the time it meant colour, and colour meant you were popular and important. It was also around this time he replaced Big Ego on the Beano title. Biffo below better watch his back because Dennis is coming for him. The 50s in general was one hell of a debuting decade for the Menace. Eventually, just like his US cousin, Dennis even began to appear on weekly newspapers. Also drawn by David Law, these strips did not appear in the Weekly Beano and instead were reused in early Dennis the Menace books. David Sutherland would become the full-time Dennis artist in 1970 after doing some shadow drawing for David Lowe here and occasionally there. He so perfectly mimicked David Lowe's art style that kids at the time had no idea a change had occurred. The strip would also be renamed to Dennis the Menace and Gnasher, but more on Gnasher later. 10 years on from when he kicked Big Ego to the curb, it was now Biffo's turn. Dennis officially became the cover star on the 14th of December 1974. This was long overdue. Biffo was a very dated and frankly very ugly and boring character. Dennis was punk and cool, and by 1970 he was so close to achieving his perfect form. As we approached the end of the 70s, his eyes began to merge into each other more commonly as the standard. This still wasn't very consistent however, and the comics would often swap between being joined or not joined. Boy, this whole eye saga has been a real whirlwind as I have researched the Menace. They didn't just arrive as his iconic look, and it took a long time for it to become the standard. Anyways, just when you think things couldn't get any better for our little hooligan, they do. In 1976 we would get the debut of the greatest club of all time. Ding! I have covered this club fully in another video if you want to learn all the sordid secrets of this secretly secret society. So let's stand back and just admire where Dennis is currently in the late 1970s. He's got the front page, he's got a club, he's got annuals and merchandise, so much merchandise. This Dennis was everywhere. His personality had softened, but he was still a very nasty little punk at heart with just slightly rounder edges. He was no longer as vicious as the 50s Dennis, and his ass paddlings weren't depicted as often and sometimes only implied, like in issue 1839. Here at the end of that comic we can see Dennis and the boys holding their bums after an implied spanking. I guess dad paddled other people's kids too. I mean, it was the 70s and it was a different time. A really different time. I mean, just look at the price of the Beano. 5p? My goodness. The 80s are when we get Thug Dennis. Basically Tony from the original Scarface in a black and red striped jumper. The tugging process began in the 70s, but my god, by the 80s we basically have a Dennis shaped like a stocky bodybuilder. I think the real reason they got rid of the slipper as a punishment is because it was unbelievable for dad to put this brute over his knee for a corporal punishment. This Dennis would absolutely curb stomp him. This is the kind of Dennis you wouldn't want to meet alone in a dark alley, or frankly a well-lit alley either. This look, I feel, is the definitive one for many people. I see comments all the time that this is how they like their boy. Beefy, brutish and battering Walter the Softy. An interesting comic from 1984 I would like to draw some attention to is this one. We get Dennis's cousin Denise dropping in and causing Thug Dennis some aggro. Burl, I mean Denise? Yeah, Denise. This is clearly Burl the Pearl. Burl was a character from The Topper created by none other than David Law, so yeah, Dennis's cousin is not an inaccurate statement. Weird they called her Denise here when she was a very popular character at the time and even had her own annuals. The character would later go on to be a member of the Dandy. Speaking of the Dandy, there have been regular crossovers over the years of Dennis and Dan. A really famous one was the first ever summer special where we see Dennis about the Jeff Jarrett our man Dan. Both also had clubs, but we all know which one was better, am I right? Another thing they had in common was they both also had dogs. I mean, Dan kind of had a dog occasionally. And speaking of dogs, Gnasher. Dennis and Gnasher. It's like fish and chips, or steak and chips, or pizza and chips. It just doesn't really feel like dinner without chips, you know? And that is what Dennis feels like without Gnasher. It's actually shocking it took them 17 years to introduce our black-haired, Abyssinian wire-haired tri-pound. Dennis's artist, David Lowe, after deciding to give his character a dog companion, struggled to find a perfect design. He would be inspired by DC Thompson writer Jim Fowler, who mentioned reading a newspaper about pets looking like their owners, and Ian Gray, who co-created Gnasher, suggested Lowe should draw Dennis the Menace's hair, put a leg on each corner, and 2 eyeballs at the end. Of course, it was obvious. Gray, who happened to be a dog breeder hobbyist, assisted with some of Gnasher's earlier stories, particularly in Pup Parade. In Gnasher's first appearance, Dad tells Dennis that people always own dogs that look like themselves. Dennis, initially skeptical, is soon convinced as he sees this theory in action. We also get to see Walter with a dog called Tiddlums, not Fifi, but still just as adorable. Big Guns was a treat even all the way back in 1968. Big Guns tells Dennis there is a dog contest, and in the next panel we see Gnasher Gnash for the first time. Dennis brings Gnasher to the show and Gnasher immediately attacks and bites every dog there. Dad and some other random dog arrive to put a stop to their reign of terror. The comic then ends with Dennis bent over preparing for a slippering while Gnasher is told to appear in next week's Pup Patrol. Gnasher's look would continue to develop, and before long he even got a face. A fun story in 1970 sees Dennis train Gnasher to be a guard dog. We get what I believe is a proto-pie face called Basher Bloggs, who wants his pie guarded for some reason. Anyways, of course, Gnasher immediately eats it, and Basher then threatens to kick Dennis's head in, but his loyal dog jumps to defend him. Unfortunately, no one is guarding Dennis's rear as Dad approaches with a slipper. While Gnasher is very anthropomorphized and can talk to the audience, characters in the Beano don't understand him. He would go on to have his own comic strips and many children. You bad boy. Ruff ruff. In some ways, he has become more of a mascot to the Beano than Dennis himself, and by the 70s the title would be changed to Dennis the Menace and Gnasher, just in time for their new position as cover stars. The 80s would have some of the most famous Dennis stories of all time, including one particular story with Gnasher I will need to cover in its own episode. Something we can talk about is the big redesign he received in 1991. Beano editor Ewan Kerr loved his publicity stunts and learned how effective they were with the famous Gnasher story. Ewan and the Beano decided on redesigning Dennis as a cool and trendy teenager. Just look at this, he is cooler than Marty McFly. Cool designer sunglasses, a trendy tracksuit, and top-of-the-range runners. He also used a Walkman. This Dennis is awesome. Let's look at those shoes again. I want them. Ewan Kerr was quoted as saying the Menace needed some street cred and an Italian designer was brought in to help freshen his look. This was all designed to enrage the public, and it did. There is a reason why he was the best editor, and that's not a small feat when you were up against other titans like George Mooney. The Beano was flooded with letters of fans letting them know their opinion on this change of direction. The history of the Beano book also talks about one person in particular, J. Chamberlain of Kimberley in Surrey, who I'm assuming is a fake person. But British people are weird and have weird names, so anyways, he wrote to one national newspaper. I don't think the Italian designer who has revamped children's comic favorite, Dennis the Menace, knows what he has done. This character isn't supposed to be a designer labeled streetwise Walkman equipped Sloane Ranger. He is an untidy, lovable rascal who gets into scrapes of his own making and thousands of children can identify with him. Let's hope that Dennis will wisely tear a hole in his new tracksuit and go back to the more wild pursuits in that black and red striped jumper he has worn so successfully for the last 40 years. So, there you go. People weren't happy, so let's have a look at the issue that debuted this new look. And it is perfect. I mean, wow. Just look at it. The cover is a single image of Dennis saying, "Yeah, cool," and talking about how rad his new look was while he snapped his finger to his Walkman's music. On the back page, we see the new outfits slowly fall apart, and Dennis tells us a real menace never changes as he abuses the softies with a pea shooter. That was the end of this new look Dennis, but it wasn't the end of him getting a new look. While this trendy design was a ruse, Dennis would begin to change for real. David Sutherland suddenly realized he had made Dennis too hulking and brutish and decided he needed to make him smaller and cuter. So we come to it at last, the perfect Dennis the Menace look. By 1994, Dennis is my Dennis. His eyes are finally consistently joined, he's been made smaller and yes, much cuter. Perhaps too cute, but by 97 he has been made a little meaner looking again. 1996 is also a very big year for our Menace. The front of the Beano was finally changed to a single image and we started to get some amazing covers. Even bigger than that change, we would get the 96 Dennis the Menace cartoon, which introduced characters like the Colonel, Dennis's neighbor, and Sergeant Slipper, the local constable. They became regulars in the comics, though the Colonel had a slightly different look for some reason. Dennis also stopped appearing on the back cover, as now with the front page being a single image, he would get a full 2 pages inside. Other things the 90s gave us were the Dennis Mobile, a new look Gnasher the Spider who became the Beanotown mascot, and maybe the biggest event the Beano ever did. In 1998, the Beano launched a multi-comic storyline. They had done stuff like this before in the 80s, and they had done that Pink Love storyline in the early 90s, which would be later adapted into the Beano video. This story, however, was bigger than all of them. It was in newspapers even over here in Ireland. Dennis the Menace was about to have a sister called Bee. Bee became the star for a while, being the center of attention in Dennis's comic, as well as having her own comic strip called Beginnings. One issue even had her appear in every other character strip in all the different art styles, which was really cool. My favorite one, I think I've said before, is the Tim Traveler one, which shows her as this brutish Hulk when she is made older. Bee was a very big deal, but wasn't the only big deal to happen at this time, as a lot really happened in 98. We got a new amazing Beano design template for the covers. David Parkins became the official Dennis artist, the Beano had its 60th birthday, and the Dennis the Menace fan club was semi-retired and begun to be phased out for the new Beano club. And most impressively of all, they attempted to bring back pro stories to crickets. Oh no! It's all happening in 1998. Dennis made his way into a new millennium where his star continued to shine. We got special issues and stories, including some that celebrated Dennis's 50th birthday, drawn by Mike Pierce. Mike Pierce, man, he was amazing, and this is one of the best Dennis stories. He had a beautiful art style that still stayed true to the characters' designs, and in this birthday special issue, we get cameos from the Dandy. Look, it's Dimples and Cuddles, and the Vicar of Dibley, and Ali G. Ali G in the Beano. I may need to do a whole episode on this comic. Dennis would continue to stand out as the icon of the Beano for the rest of the decade. Being the cover star of the Beano and his own annuals and appearing in the video game, the Beano Superstar series would also eventually just become a Dennis series. I guess the other characters didn't sell as well. Sorry Roger, looked like you dodged success. The Superstar series would eventually adapt the 96 series. Here is an adaptation of one of my favorite episodes. Perhaps when I cover the series I can look through these adaptations and compare. The Beano introduced a magazine called BeanoMax, which once again was the Dennis the Menace show. So much so in fact it was later just renamed the official Dennis the Menace and Gnasher's Epic magazine. And then later to Epic magazine and to Epic. It's a whole crazy thing, but I have a whole video covering the saga on my channel, so make sure to check that out. Nigel Parkinson slowly transitioned into being the main comic artist in 2004, along with others who would cover from time to time. A big revamp came in 2009, with the new cartoon series hitting the screens. I was well gone by this stage, but I remember seeing the covers around the time and being mildly irritated by them. I don't know why. It's nice, it looks good, but it's not my Dennis. Happily, Barry Appleby would return Dennis back to normal in 2011 and bring back old characters. He wouldn't stay long however, as Nigel Parkinson finally took his rightful place as the sole artist and has held the position ever since 2014. In 2014 we would also get the Diary of a Wimpy Kid inspired The Diary of Dennis the Menace. I haven't read any of these, so let's take a look at some of its reviews. I liked it because it made my head blow off with laughing so much, and now I am a true menace. 9-year-old boy, Amazon.co.uk. Well, there you go. It sounds great. While I never read them, I have always been aware of the series thanks to its incredible art style. It's so different to any other Dennis design we have ever had, yet at the same time, it's so perfect in capturing the spirit. It really pops out and grabs your attention and captures that menacing presence maybe better than any other look the character has had over the years. For the Beano's 75th anniversary, Dennis's parents were given a noticeable redesign. Dad became a pot-bellied man with black spiky hair and clothing in a color scheme similar to Dennis, while Mom was shown with red shaggy hair. It was revealed in issue 39-32 that Dennis's father was in fact the original Dennis the Menace from the 1980s. This was revealed in a special strip about him running for mayor, during which his rival, Walter the Softy's father, launched a smear campaign by showing voters old videos of Dennis Sr.'s childhood mischief. Editor-in-Chief Mike Sterling explained, "There's no definable lineage in Dennis and Gnasher, but there can only ever be one Dennis at any time. It serves as a salutary warning that even the coolest kids can become boring grown-ups." I have said in the past I wasn't a fan of this, but it's fine. It's been 10 years now, so it is what it is. The old Hitler Tash dad is gone, and he was probably a bit too outdated looking for modern readers anyways. There were other designs we got, such as this manga chibi version of Dennis, which honestly is actually pretty cute. I like it. So, things are going swimmingly, but then it happened. 2017, when everything changed. Curly moved away and Pieface disappeared for a bit and returned as someone else. We got Ruby and JJ. I actually really like Ruby by herself in her own strip and art style. JJ I don't really have much of an opinion on. She has these JJ joke sections and they're perfectly fine for what they are. But as an out of touch man far too old to read the Beano, it is hard for me to get used to these new characters and to lose mainstays like Curly and the real Pieface. I have to be fair though, I don't read the comic, and from everything I have heard, the modern Dennis stories written by Nigel are meant to be very good. So no shouting at clouds for this old Ashley. 2017 also gave us Dennis and Gnasher Unleashed. This show has 103 episodes. Was it good? Who knows? Even if it is, that is so many episodes. Oh boy, I'm dreading covering that in the future. Perhaps the biggest change came in 2018 when Dennis was removed as the cover star. He does still appear on the cover, but now he rotates with all the other characters and is no longer the main star, and honestly, I think it has really diminished him. him. Looking through modern stories with the characters, he still looks nice. There was a period when his eyes were separated, but they eventually reversed that, but he isn't, he's Noddy's perfection. The stories are very colourful, and one thing I have noticed is that Nigel Parkinson seems to love drawing him with a lamp or torch and giving him weird colours. Walter at some point as well in the late 2000s was changed from Big Guns Walter to this nasty little fake guns. He also seems to have been replaced in prominence by his dad and doesn't seem to appear as much anymore. I do like the dad character however, and I think it would be a nice contrast to return Walter to his Softy roots, and down the line I think we need to do a history of Walter the Softy video. And there we are. That was Dennis the Menace. As in-depth as I went, it only scratched the surface, and honestly, there was a lot more. Dennis has over 70 years of history, and it was more ups than downs honestly. I also feel he has outlasted his American cousin in terms of relevancy, as despite having some movies, you don't really hear or see anything about that character anymore. But then again, maybe that is just me having some tunnel vision. One thing I do think is that I don't think the real Dennis the Menace will be disappearing anytime soon. Dong. Wow, that was a lot of history, but I hope you enjoyed it. I considered including sections on all of Dennis's other pets and characters, but maybe these should get their own episodes, particularly Walter. So let me know what you think down below in the comments, and who knows, maybe I will say a thing or two about a thing or two for